Welcome to Citizen University TV. I'm Eric Liu. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the topic of civic agenda setting. It was JFK who said that to govern is to choose among competing priorities, among a cacophony of lobbyists and advocates trying to get the attention of policymakers. And this process of how choices get made, how certain things get put on the agenda or left off the agenda, is one that is mysterious to many citizens. And so what we want to do today is just dive deep into this topic and break down what it means to set the agenda and to get onto the agenda of our policymakers and our decision makers. There are three different dimensions to this question, and we're going to talk about each one of them. The first is simply this: who decides? Who's in the room where it happens? Who makes the choices? The second then is what issues get decided? What makes it onto the docket and what gets left off, either because it had to and there's no time, or because someone really tried hard to keep it off the agenda. And then number three, how are these decisions made? What's the rule set that determines the ways in which these choices and priorities get determined? Now, all three of these things touch on each other and interlock with one another, but let's talk about each one in turn. We'll start with who decides. So the question of who decides really is very fundamental to politics. You have to ask yourself, as a citizen, if you're trying to push a certain issue onto the media and the political agenda, who do I need to persuade? Sometimes it's the vote of all the people, so you've got to persuade all your fellow citizens. But much of the time in politics, it's some smaller subset of people. Maybe it's elected representatives on different issues. Maybe it's people who serve in an appointed body, and you've got to figure out, who do I have to talk to? And most of the time in politics, that's a very outside game. It's public. They're in an arena. They're holding public meetings that are getting televised where an audience is welcome, and you can identify, okay, that's policymaker X, that's decision maker Y. But there's another dimension of who, and that is really the question of who's behind closed doors. Who's not sitting necessarily at the city council chambers? Who's not sitting in the legislative chambers? Who actually might be the power behind the throne? Maybe it's a really influential aide. Maybe it's a spouse or a loved one or a friend of a decision maker or a policymaker. Maybe it's a really effective lobbyist. All these people who might have access to the decision makers are as crucial to this question of who as those who have the formal authority and title. Understanding this informal, closed-door dimension of the who is really important. And as a citizen, we're not taught this. We're certainly not taught it in civics class. But anybody who knows how to make stuff happen in politics quickly figures out that this closed-door dimension, the inside game, is really crucial to making sure that your issues get onto the agenda. Well, that brings us to the second dimension of civic agenda setting, and that is this: what issues are decided? Now, the what is really self-explanatory in many ways. There is an infinite, limitless number of issues that can make it onto an agenda. Maybe it's the flat tax, maybe it's marriage equality, maybe it's gender identity and public restrooms, maybe it's gun control. All of these questions are competing for the finite, limited attention of policymakers. And so when you think about what can make its way on there, what you're looking at here with all of these issues, imagine people, organizations, and advocacy groups behind each one of these things. This is the jostle and the bustle of politics. This is what Madison called the battle of factions. Factions fighting for attention, trying to get their issues onto the agenda, trying to get the attention of media and public alike. And one of the things that you have to recognize when you think about what finally makes it onto the agenda is not only to see at any given legislative session or a meeting of a legislative body what's on that piece of paper that says, today we shall consider A, B, C, and D, right? But to recognize that for everything that makes it onto the agenda, a bunch of things didn't, right? So for instance, in the question of health insurance, yeah, maybe with Obamacare, we talked about health insurance subsidies and this big system of health insurance subsidies, but what never quite made it fully onto the legislative agenda was the broader question of, should we have a single-payer healthcare system, government-run Medicare for all style healthcare? On the question of taxes, for instance, people have been advocating for a flat tax, and there have been various legislative proposals that have moved somewhat down the path of becoming law. But no one really has been successful at making outright abolishment of the IRS truly a likely political outcome. Why is that? Why do certain things make it? And that's partly a matter of choice and priority. But then there are other issues altogether, like why don't we have in the United States state ownership of the means of production? That issue never gets on the agenda. Even in Seattle, where we have a socialist city council member. Why? Because even apart from the choice making that happens when you have agendas in legislative bodies like this, there's another dimension of the what, and that is about ideology. In a society like ours, that is a capitalist society, people in legislative roles and in politics don't really think about the possibility of something that is non-capitalist. They might think about how to adjust capitalism, they might think about how to tame or contain capitalism, but it's not really on the agenda in our national political system to say, you know what, let's scrap capitalism, let's do full-on socialism and communism. Now, that really is a malleable thing. You could imagine a time in our politics where maybe that does become more plausible a thing that's on the agenda, but today it is not. And so it's really important for us to understand as citizens not only what makes it onto the docket, but what doesn't, and to think about why that is, why it is that certain things get there and don't get there. Well, that brings us to the third dimension of civic agenda setting, and that's this question of how. How are things decided? What is the rule set? And in any public decision-making arena, you'll have rules that are laid down, universal rules that must be applied universally. Sometimes, certainly in most legislative bodies, you have a rule of majority rule. The idea of 50% plus one of the representatives shall determine whether something is yea or nay. Yet even here, of course, sometimes it requires a supermajority. If you want to pass a treaty in the United States Senate, that's 2/3. If you want to pass a constitutional amendment, that's 2/3. So it's not always majority rule, but then sometimes it's not always about our elected representatives either. There are appointed bodies. Here in the city, you have things like the library board. You have other commissions in our national government that are not elected representatives, and yet still here you have to think about what are the rules that they operate by. Is it a majority of those folks? Is it unanimity? What are the ways in which these bodies operate? And of course, you also have in another branch of government, judges. Judges making law, judges making rules. And here, it's a totally different arena and game. For us as citizens to understand this dimension of what are the rules requires us to think with a little bit of civic imagination. We tend, anytime we go into any game, it could be a baseball game, a sports game, it could be a board game, but certainly the game of politics, we tend to take as given the rule set that we inherit. But we have to remember, there's nothing given here. Just because we've always elected city council members and state legislators and members of Congress by a first past the post, 50% plus one winner takes all rule, doesn't mean that we have to forever. We could change that rule set so that it became a matter of proportional representation, so that you could have something like they have in other countries where you have a whole group of parties, not just two parties represented in the legislative body. Those are all questions of rules. And, you know, on one level, this sounds like a big yawner, these parliamentary questions of how do you design rules, how do you make sure that those rules are applied neutrally and fairly. But this is the game. Anywhere you go in politics, certainly in any legislative body, there's always something like a rules committee. As we think about the presidential campaigns that are unfolding and the presidential conventions, they have rules committees, and those rules determine how delegates get allocated, how delegates get seated. And as everybody knows right now, that is a contentious set of questions. And if you control the rules, you control the game. You control the flow of the game and the set of possible outcomes. So as citizens, we have to both be literate in that rule set and figure out ways that we can actually influence it. Well, here in our own city, there's a whole set of issues where you can see all of these dimensions of civic agenda setting in action. But there's one in particular that I think is really emblematic of the who and the what and the how of civic agenda setting. And that's a youth participatory budgeting project. It goes by the name in our city of Youth Voice, Youth Choice. And what participatory budgeting does, in short, is the city council sets aside a pot of money, and in this case grants a group of citizens, young citizens here, the power to decide how shall they spend that money. How shall they set priorities? How shall they allocate those funds? On what issues? On what concerns? And by what rules? And this example of participatory budgeting is a great case study. So let's take a deeper dive into Youth Voice, Youth Choice.